Charles Dickens was born on a cold February day in 1812 in Portsmouth, England. His father, John Dickens, worked as a clerk in the Navy Pay Office, a man who loved books but loved spending money even more. His mother, Elizabeth, had dreams for her children, dreams that would soon be crushed under the weight of unpaid bills and constant moving from house to house. As a boy, Charles was bright, curious, and full of life. He loved to read and would often sit by the window for hours, devouring any book he could find. His favorites were novels filled with adventure and mystery, but life had its own story written for him, a story much darker than any he could have imagined. The Dickens family struggled. Rent was always overdue. Creditors knocking at the door became a regular sound in their home. His father's habit of living beyond his means made their life unstable. Charles watched as his parents whispered in the corners of their small rooms, counting coins they didn't have, worrying about how to feed their growing family. Then came the day that would change everything. Charles was 12 years old when his father was arrested and thrown into Marshalsea debtors' prison. The man who had once told him bedtime stories was now behind cold, iron bars, not because he had committed a crime, but because he was poor. With his father in prison and his mother unable to care for all the children, Charles was pulled out of school, a place he loved, and sent to work. He never forgot that day. He walked to Warren's blacking warehouse, a place where they made shoe polish with heavy steps and a heavier heart. The factory was dark and filthy. Rats ran freely in the corners. The smell of chemicals burned his nose. His job was to paste labels on bottles of blacking over and over for hours. His small hands, meant for books and dreams, were now sticky with glue and dirt. He worked 10, sometimes 12 hours a day, standing on sore feet, earning just enough to keep his family from starving. There was no time for books, no time for friends, no time for being a child. Sometimes at night, Charles would walk through the streets of London, watching the gas lamps flicker in the fog. He saw children like himself, cold and hungry, sleeping on the streets. He saw rich men in warm coats walk past without a glance. In those moments, Charles felt invisible. He lived in a tiny room, alone, away from his family, and cried himself to sleep many nights. He missed his siblings, he missed his father, and most of all, he missed the boy he used to be. The boy who loved to read and dream. Even when his father was released from prison after months of suffering, Charles was not brought home right away. His mother insisted he keep working at the factory. That betrayal stung in a way that never fully healed. For the rest of his life, he could not understand why his mother let him suffer so long in that terrible place. But Charles carried something else with him, a sharp memory. He remembered every face, every cruel word, every unfair moment. He stored them deep inside, like pieces of broken glass, sharp and painful. Slowly, life began to shift. After about a year, Charles finally left the blacking factory and went back to school. But he was no longer the same boy. He had seen too much. As he sat in the classroom trying to catch up on lessons, he thought about the boys he worked with in the factory. Boys who would never escape that life. Years passed. Charles grew older. He finished school and got a job as a clerk in a law office. He hated the endless paperwork, but it paid the bills. Then he found work as a court reporter, sitting in courtrooms all day, writing down every word of trials and hearings. There, he saw more of what he had seen as a boy. The poor punished for being poor, the rich walking free, and children suffering in silence. Charles Dickens was no longer just a boy who had survived the factory. He was now a man who had something to say, but he didn't speak, not yet. He wrote at night by candlelight. He filled pages with words. Stories poured out of him. Stories of children like himself, of men like his father, of women struggling to survive in a world that didn't care. His pain, his anger, his hope, all of it went into those pages, and soon the world would read them. But that's a story for another day. Charles Dickens was no longer the boy who worked in the dark, rat-infested factory, but the shadows of those days never left his heart. When he grew older, he found a job as a clerk in a law office, a small man in a big city, surrounded by papers, books, and the voices of rich men arguing over money. He sat quietly at his desk, copying legal documents, listening to the world of the powerful, and thinking about the world of the powerless, the world he had known as a child. At night, when London went to sleep and the streets were quiet except for the sound of horses on the cobblestones, Dickens would sit by candlelight and write. His pen was fast, his thoughts faster. Words poured out of him, memories of the dark streets, the crying children, the hopeless mothers, and the angry, hungry men. The city that ignored him when he was poor could no longer shut its ears when he began to write. His first pieces were small sketches of everyday life in London. They were funny, sharp, filled with humor and sadness at the same time. People loved loved them, they laughed, but they also felt the pain in his words, though they did not yet know the story of the man who wrote them. He used the name Boz, so no one knew who he was, but soon everyone would know his name. In 1836, he got his first real chance to show the world what he could do. A publisher asked him to write a series of stories to go along with comic drawings. Dickens agreed. Every month, a new part of the story came out, and people were waiting for it like people now wait for the next episode of their favorite show. The story was called The Pickwick Papers, and it made Charles Dickens famous. Suddenly, he was not the poor boy working in a factory. He was the man everyone in London was talking about, but even as he became rich, he could not forget the hungry boy he had been, and he did not want the world to forget boys like that either. So when he wrote his next book, he did not write about rich people or funny adventures. He wrote about a boy just like himself, a boy with no parents, no home, and no one to love him. That boy's name was Oliver Twist. People were shocked when they read Oliver Twist. No one had written about poor children like this before. No one had described the workhouses where orphans were sent to starve. No one had dared to show the streets full of crime, where boys were taught to steal or die. Dickens wrote it all, and the world could not look away. As Dickens became more famous, he also became busier. He got married to Catherine Hogarth and started a family. They had 10 children. On the outside, it seemed like he had everything: money, fame, a big house, a beautiful family. But inside, Dickens was still fighting the fear that he might lose it all. He remembered what it was like to have nothing, to be thrown out on the street, and to watch his father taken to prison. So he worked harder than anyone else. He wrote book after book, sometimes staying up all night to finish a chapter. He gave public readings of his books, standing in front of huge crowds, making them laugh and cry. But no matter how much he had, he was never at peace. The boy from the factory still lived inside him, always whispering, "Be careful, or you will lose everything again." Still, Dickens never stopped fighting for the poor. In 1843, when he saw how children were still working in factories and families were still starving at Christmas, he decided to write a story that would make people care. He sat down, and in just a few weeks, he wrote A Christmas Carol. It was the story of a cold, greedy man named Scrooge, who cared for nothing but his gold. But on Christmas Eve, Scrooge is visited by 3 ghosts: the ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas present, and the ghost of Christmas yet to come. They show him his life, his mistakes, and what will happen if he does not change. When A Christmas Carol was published, it was an instant success. People read it and wept. They saw themselves in Scrooge, and many decided to change their ways. That book did something no law had been able to do. It made people think about the poor, about kindness, about how we all need each other. Even as he became more famous, Dickens never stopped walking through the streets of London, watching, listening, remembering. He saw the children begging for food, the mothers holding sick babies, the men without work. He wrote it all down. He turned their suffering into stories that would live forever. But success did not make Dickens happy. His marriage began to fall apart. He fought with Catherine, and after many years they separated. He was tired, always working, always running from the fear of being poor again. Even when he traveled to America, where people cheered him like a king, he felt alone. Yet he kept writing. Books like David Copperfield, Bleak House, Hard Times, and Great Expectations came from that place deep inside him, where his pain and his hope lived side by side. He wrote about orphans, about cruel schools, about rich men who crushed the poor, and he made people listen. Charles Dickens, the boy who had once worked in a dirty factory, had become the voice of all the forgotten people. He told their stories so loudly that even the richest men in England had to hear. But even as the world loved him, Dickens was still haunted by the ghosts of his past. The boy in the factory, the son of the man in prison, the child who cried alone in a dark room. He never truly left. And maybe that is why Dickens could write so beautifully, so painfully, and so truly, because he never forgot. As Charles Dickens grew older, his fame only grew larger. Wherever he went, people gathered to see him, to hear him speak, to thank him for the stories that had touched their lives. He was no longer just a writer. He was a voice for millions, a man who had shown the world the faces of the poor, the forgotten, and the broken. But fame and success came at a cost. Dickens was tired. His body was worn out from years of endless work, and his heart carried heavy burdens. His marriage with Catherine had fallen apart completely. After years of struggle and unhappiness, Dickens separated from her and never looked back. Though they had 10 children, and though she had been with him since before he was famous, Dickens could not bear the life they shared anymore. Instead, he focused on his work. His books became darker, heavier. He wrote Bleak House, where he exposed the broken legal system that left the poor to suffer for years. He wrote Hard Times, where he showed how factories crush the souls of children, turning them into machines. scenes. He wrote Little Dorrit, a story that returned to the world he knew so well, the debtors' prisons, the cold-hearted rich, and the endless struggle of the poor. But the book that touched him the deepest was David Copperfield. It was his most personal story, the one where he finally poured out the secrets of his own life. The orphan boy, the cruel stepfather, the hard work, the hunger. David's story was Charles' story. As he wrote it, Dickens relived every dark moment of his childhood, and for the first time, he let the world see his own scars. People loved David Copperfield. They felt the truth in its pages, and many guessed that Dickens was writing about himself, but he never fully admitted it. Perhaps the pain was too much to name aloud. As he aged, Dickens began to do something new: public readings. He would stand on a stage before hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, and read aloud from his books. His voice would rise and fall, full of emotion. He would act out the characters, becoming Scrooge, Oliver Twist, or Fagin. People laughed, cried, and cheered. But these readings took a heavy toll on Dickens. He traveled to America for a second time, and though crowds greeted him like a hero, the journey exhausted him. He was no longer young. His body, pushed too hard for too long, was beginning to break down. Still, he would not stop. There were more stories to tell, more injustice to fight. In his final years, Dickens worked on Our Mutual Friend, a story filled with mystery and darkness. He was fascinated by the way money could destroy people, how greed could turn men into monsters. He had seen it his whole life, and now he wrote about it with sharp, cutting words. But while working on his last book, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, Dickens' health grew worse. His face was pale, his hands often trembled, and he had terrible pain in his chest. Yet, he refused to rest. He had lived his whole life working. He did not know how to stop. On June 8th, 1870, Charles Dickens was at home, sitting at his desk, when he collapsed from a stroke. The man who had written about the suffering of others was now suffering himself. He never regained consciousness. The next day, on June 9th, Charles Dickens died. He was 58 years old. His death shocked the world. The streets of London were filled with people mourning him. They placed flowers, cried in public, and talked about what he had meant to them. People from all walks of life, rich and poor, young and old, grieved together. But even though Dickens was gone, his words were still alive. His books were in every home, every library. His stories of Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, and Ebenezer Scrooge continue to speak to people, reminding them of the importance of kindness, justice, and hope. Even today, when we read A Christmas Carol and see Scrooge learning to care for others, we are hearing Dickens' voice. When we read about Oliver Twist asking for more food in the workhouse, we are seeing through Dickens' eyes, remembering the boy he once was, hungry and afraid. Charles Dickens had done something few writers ever do. He had changed the world. He had made the rich see the poor, made the comfortable see the suffering, made everyone understand that no child should ever have to live the life he lived. And though his life was filled with struggle and pain, Dickens never gave up. He turned his suffering into stories that made the world better. In the end, the boy who once pasted labels on blacking bottles in a dark factory became a man whose words will never be forgotten, because Charles Dickens knew the truth that stories can change hearts, and when hearts change, so can the world.